The UK economy has long been one of the most stable and powerful in the world. But in recent years, even such a robust economy has faced serious challenges. Record inflation, rising unemployment, and a brain drain of skilled workers are just some of the issues the country is grappling with today. Past achievements seem to lose their significance, and now the question looms, what's next for the UK? This isn't just a temporary crisis that will blow over in a few years. The real question is, how will the country recover from these blows? Looking at the current state of the UK economy, we see one of the highest inflation rates in Europe, hovering around 6 to 7% by the end of 2023. Energy prices are skyrocketing, and average wages simply can't keep up with the rising cost of living. Add to this the problems with migration and the loss of access to cheap labor after Brexit, and we have a rather alarming picture. In the face of these difficulties, the UK is being forced to cut public spending, raise taxes, and slash funding for social programs. The healthcare system is in crisis, homelessness is on the rise, and there's a shortage of skilled labor. But these are just the surface-level problems British citizens are dealing with today. What led to this? How did a country that just a few decades ago was a model of economic success end up in this position? In this video, we'll break down every aspect of this crisis, starting with the golden 1990s, when the UK was at the peak of its economic power. After the economic turbulence of the 1970s and 1980s, the UK entered the 1990s with immense potential. This was a time many considered a golden period for the economy. Economic reforms from the previous decades began to bear fruit, with productivity growth and a surge in investment making the UK one of the most competitive economies globally. In the 1990s, unemployment rates significantly dropped. While unemployment was over 10% at the start of the decade, by the end, it had fallen to around 6%. The country also experienced impressive GDP growth, averaging 2 to 3% per year, on par with other leading economies such as the United States and Germany. During this time, the UK not only became a magnet for investors, but also emerged as a global leader in the financial sector. London was hailed as the financial capital of the world, attracting capital from across the globe. It's also important to note the rise in the standard of living. In the 1990s, Britons began to feel the benefits of economic reforms. Wages were rising, inflation was under control, around 2 to 3% annually, and access to goods and services significantly improved. Consumer spending was on the rise, with British families able to afford more durable goods like cars, household appliances, and international travel. Average wages increased by 20% during this period, boosting the middle class and improving overall prosperity. Technological innovation also played a key role in the economic boom. By the mid-90s, the UK had begun to focus on developing high-tech industries and financial services, which helped it become a leader in the IT sector and e-commerce. For example, by 1999, around 30% of UK companies were actively using the internet in their operations, a significant leap forward for the economy. However, despite these successes, the late 90s began to show signs of looming problems. Many experts pointed to underinvestment in infrastructure and the growing deficit in public spending. These underinvestments would later become a key reason for the slowdown in productivity growth and the deterioration of social infrastructure. So, the 1990s were indeed a golden era for the UK economy. The country had all the chances to be a model of sustainable growth for decades to come. But how did this brilliant period transform into the series of crises we see today? Let's now explore what changed. Brexit became one of the most significant events in modern UK history. In 2016, when 52% of the population voted to leave the European Union, it seemed that the country was on the path to restoring its economic and political independence. However, as the past few years have shown, the economic consequences of this decision have been far more complex and painful than many anticipated. One of the first and most noticeable effects was the sharp decline in foreign trade. Before leaving the EU, over 43% of British exports went to EU countries. After Brexit, many companies faced new tariffs, quotas, and customs barriers, significantly raising costs. For example, British exporters working with the EU have reported additional transportation and logistics expenses, which ultimately lead to higher consumer prices. In 2021, UK exports to the EU fell by 15% compared to the previous year. But one of the most serious issues caused by Brexit has been the labor shortage. The UK was previously a prime destination for EU migrants, who filled crucial jobs in industries such as agriculture, construction, and services. Today, many businesses are struggling with a severe shortage of workers, leading to reduced productivity and higher labor costs. The healthcare sector, for example, lost tens of thousands of skilled workers, exacerbating the ongoing crisis in the NHS. In addition, after Brexit, the UK lost access to numerous EU programs and funds that previously supported scientific research, educational initiatives, and infrastructure projects. In 2019, the EU allocated around €4.5 billion to the UK for various projects, which are now unavailable to the country. Overall, the economic consequences of Brexit can be likened to a slowing train that is losing momentum but cannot stop. The loss of market access, labor shortages, and new trade barriers have posed serious challenges to the economy. And while Brexit proponents argued that leaving the EU would allow the UK to control its economic destiny, the reality has proven to be much more complicated and uncertain. One of the most serious consequences of Brexit has been the labor shortage, which has hit key sectors of the UK economy hard. Before leaving the European Union, the UK heavily relied on cheap and accessible labor from EU countries, especially in industries like agriculture, construction, and hospitality. However, since leaving the EU, the situation has changed dramatically. Many companies, particularly those dependent on EU migrants, are now facing significant difficulties in finding workers. For example, in agriculture, the shortage of seasonal workers has led to reduced production and even wasted crops. According to 2022 data, about 60% of farmers reported that they were unable to harvest all of their crops due to the lack of labor, ultimately resulting in higher food prices. The healthcare sector has also been severely affected. Before Brexit, more than 10% of NHS National Health Service workers were EU citizens, filling vital roles from doctors to nurses and support staff. After Brexit and the introduction of new visa rules, many of them returned to their home countries or moved to other nations with more attractive working conditions. As a result, the UK faced a sharp increase in healthcare staffing shortages, which became particularly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, Brexit has made it more difficult to attract highly skilled professionals. Many companies in sectors such as IT, finance, and engineering report challenges in hiring talent from the EU. Before 2020, the UK attracted a large number of talented professionals, thanks to its openness to labor migration. But today, according to consulting firm KPMG, about 20% of highly skilled EU professionals have left the country, and the inflow of new talent has sharply declined. When comparing the UK with countries like Germany and Canada, it becomes clear how crucial migrant labor is for stable economic development. Germany, for example, actively recruits both highly skilled and low-skilled workers, offering them favorable conditions for employment. As a result, despite the pandemic and other challenges, Germany's economy has been less vulnerable to labor shortages. In conclusion, labor and migration issues pose significant risks to the UK economy, reducing productivity and slowing growth in key sectors. Without a clear strategy to attract new workers, the country could face further economic difficulties. Inflation has become one of the most painful consequences of the UK's recent economic challenges. While the prices of energy and food are rising rapidly, real incomes are failing to keep pace, leading to a decline in purchasing power and growing social tension. One of the key drivers of the current inflation spike is the global energy crisis, worsened by sanctions against Russia. In the UK, which heavily depends on gas and oil imports, the rise in global energy prices has led to a significant increase in electricity and fuel costs. By the end of 2023, inflation in the country was around 7%, one of the highest rates among developed nations. By comparison, inflation in the Eurozone was about 5%, and in the US, it stood at around 4%. At the same time, wages are simply not keeping up with the rising costs. According to the UK Office for National Statistics, average wage growth was about percent over the past year, which clearly does not cover the current increase in the cost of living. As a result, many families are forced to spend more on essentials like food, heating, and transportation, leaving them with little disposable income for other goods and services. Surveys conducted in 2022 showed that about 35% of British families reported being unable to afford their usual spending on leisure and holidays, which has a serious impact on domestic consumption and the overall economy. Another negative effect of inflation is the decline in business confidence. Rising costs, price instability, and uncertainty about future government actions are causing companies to freeze investment projects and cut spending. This, in turn, leads to lower productivity and slower economic growth. Unlike the UK, some other countries have taken more aggressive measures to combat inflation. For example, the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank began raising interest rates in early 2022, which helped curb inflation expectations and stabilize price growth. In the UK, however, inflation control measures started later, resulting in more prolonged effects on the economy. Thus, inflation and wage stagnation remain among the main threats to the UK economy. Without a clear and coordinated policy to reduce inflation and support household incomes, the country risks facing even greater economic and social challenges. The energy crisis has become one of the key drivers of the UK's recent economic troubles. The country, which has long relied on imported energy resources, found itself in a highly vulnerable position when global oil and gas prices began to skyrocket. This crisis was exacerbated by sanctions against Russia, one of Europe's largest energy suppliers. Despite having its own North Sea oil reserves, the UK remains heavily dependent on imported gas, which has been the main factor driving up domestic energy prices. By the end of 2022, electricity bills for the average British household had risen by more than 18% compared to the previous year. Faced with soaring energy costs, many households were forced to choose between cutting back on heating or reducing spending on other essentials. According to a survey conducted in early 2023, around 40% of Britons reported having to cut back on food and basic goods to pay their energy bills. But the energy crisis didn't just hit households. Industrial enterprises, which traditionally rely on electricity and gas, were hit hard by the sharp rise in costs. Many companies, especially in energy-intensive industries such as steel production, chemicals, and agriculture, were forced to cut production or move operations to other countries with more stable energy prices. For example, the UK's largest steel producers, such as British Steel, reported a 15 to 20% reduction in production during 2022 to 2023 due to soaring energy costs. The situation is further complicated by the fact that the UK has lagged in investing in renewable energy. While several wind and solar energy projects have been launched in recent years, these efforts have been insufficient to compensate for lost gas and oil supplies. Currently, it is estimated that around 35% of the UK's electricity comes from renewable sources, significantly lower than countries like Germany, around 50%, or Denmark, over 60%. To cope with the crisis, the UK government had to implement emergency measures. In 2022 to 2023, temporary support was introduced for households and businesses to mitigate the impact of high energy prices. These measures included subsidies for electricity bills and temporary reductions in energy taxes. However, these were short-term solutions and did not address the underlying issue, the need for long-term investment in energy infrastructure. Thus, the energy crisis remains one of the biggest threats to the UK economy. Without a shift to more sustainable and independent energy sources, the country risks facing even more severe economic consequences in the future. One of the key issues exacerbating the economic downturn in the UK is chronic underinvestment in critical sectors and cuts in public spending. This problem has long-term consequences and creates significant barriers to productivity growth, infrastructure renewal, and the support of the social sector. For years, the UK has adhered to a policy of fiscal austerity. In the early 2010s, as the country was swept by a wave of austerity measures following the 2008 global financial crisis, the Conservative government began actively cutting spending on social programs, healthcare, and education. The goal was to reduce the budget deficit and stabilize the national debt. However, This strategy had the opposite effect, slowing economic growth and reducing the quality of life for much of the population. One of the most visible outcomes of this policy is the decline in infrastructure investment. Over the past decade, investments in transportation, energy infrastructure, and social facilities, schools, hospitals, have been significantly reduced. According to the Office for National Statistics, infrastructure investment levels in the 2020s fell to 1.6% of GDP, much lower than in other developed countries. For comparison, Germany invests around 3.5% of GDP in infrastructure and the US around 2.7%. Underinvestment has led to the postponement or outright cancellation of many important projects. For instance, the modernization of the UK's rail system, known as HS2, has been repeatedly delayed due to funding shortages, slowing down the development of the transport network. This has serious consequences not only for the mobility of citizens, but also for businesses that face increased logistics and transportation costs. Additionally, cuts in public spending have affected healthcare and education, leading to greater social instability. The healthcare sector is experiencing staff shortages and a lack of equipment, which was particularly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. Budget cuts to schools and universities are reducing access to quality education and limiting the training of new skilled professionals, negatively impacting the country's competitiveness in the long term. Underinvestment also impacts labor productivity. In 2022, the UK's labor productivity was 15% lower than in the US and Germany. This is largely due to insufficient investments in modernizing production, adopting new technologies, and employee training. The lack of investment in innovation is causing the country to fall behind in global competition and is reducing its ability to respond to economic challenges. The UK finds itself in a vicious cycle. Underinvestment reduces productivity, which in turn slows economic growth and limits the ability to increase public revenues. Without radical changes in investment policy, the country risks continued economic stagnation and a deepening crisis in the social sphere. One of the most pressing challenges facing the UK today is the crisis in healthcare and social services. The National Health Service, NHS, once the pride of the British social economic model, is now in a dire state. Staff shortages, underfunding, and system overload are all negatively affecting the health of the population and the stability of the country as a whole. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the healthcare system has been at the forefront of the battle against the virus, increasing the burden on doctors and medical staff. However, problems in the NHS began long before the pandemic. As a result of years of government budget cuts and underinvestment, the system was unable to properly prepare for such emergencies. As of 2023, the NHS is experiencing a shortage of more than 100,000 medical workers, including doctors, nurses, and other staff. In comparison, before 2010, the shortage was less than 50,000 people. The financial instability of healthcare is further exacerbated by cuts in public spending. As of 2022, healthcare spending in the UK accounted for about 10% of GDP, significantly less than in countries with advanced healthcare systems, such as Germany, about 12%, or France, about 11%. At the same time, waiting lists for treatment continue to grow, and patients face months of waiting to receive basic medical services. In 2023, the average waiting time for emergency surgery in the UK reached a record 6 months, almost double the figure from 2010. The lack of resources has also affected social services. Budget cuts in this sector have led to a decline in the quality of care for vulnerable groups, including the elderly and people with disabilities. According to a report by the Social Affairs Committee, since 2015, the number of nursing homes and care facilities has decreased by 12%, and access to social services has become more restricted. This, in turn, places a greater burden on relatives and informal caregivers, further exacerbating the problem. The rise in homelessness and unemployment is also a consequence of cuts in social programs. In 2023, the homelessness rate in the UK reached 0.9%, the highest level in the past 20 years. This means that around 300,000 people are forced to live on the streets or in temporary shelters, creating additional social problems and increasing the pressure on social services. The impact of the crisis in healthcare and social services affects not only the current generation, but also the country's future. Insufficient access to quality medical care and support leads to higher mortality rates, a lower quality of life, and deepening social inequality. Without significant changes in the funding policies for healthcare and social services, the UK risks facing even more profound consequences, affecting the health of the nation and social stability. The UK is facing a unique situation. Record-high tax increases have coincided with ongoing cuts in public spending on essential social programs and infrastructure. This combination has resulted from several factors, from the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis to the government's decision to reduce public debt and the budget deficit through tax hikes. By 2023, the UK reached historically high levels of taxation. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, IFS, tax revenues reached 37% of GDP, a record over the past 70 years. For comparison, in 2010, this figure was about 33%. This has led to a significant increase in the tax burden on both businesses and households. The main sources of additional tax revenues have been increases in income tax, corporation tax, and national insurance contributions. These measures were intended to reduce the budget deficit and stabilize the economy, but they also resulted in a reduction in disposable income for citizens and a decrease in business investment. One of the main consequences of rising taxes has been a decline in consumer spending. By the end of 2022, consumption levels in the country had fallen by 3% compared to the previous year, the largest drop since the 2008 financial crisis. Households have been saving more and spending less on durable goods such as cars and household appliances. This, in turn, has negatively impacted the domestic market and slowed economic growth. In addition, higher taxes have had a negative impact on small and medium-sized businesses. Many companies, especially in the service and retail sectors, have found themselves in a difficult situation due to rising tax and insurance costs. According to the Federation of Small Businesses, about 25% of companies said they plan to reduce staff or close some branches in the coming years due to financial pressure. This could lead to higher unemployment and further reductions in household incomes. At the same time, public spending cuts are worsening the problem. Despite the rise in tax revenues, the government continues to reduce funding for social programs, infrastructure, and other vital sectors. For example, spending on education and healthcare has been reduced by 5% over the past 3 years, negatively affecting the quality and accessibility of services for the population. This paradox, rising taxes alongside cuts in public spending, is putting pressure on both businesses and the public. As a result, the UK faces the problem of slowing economic growth, reduced investment, and a declining quality of life. Without a reassessment of tax policy and increased investment in social and infrastructure projects, the country risks deepening its current crisis. The economic problems facing the UK require not only analysis, but also solutions. The country is at a point where the decisions made in the coming years will determine its direction for decades to come. What steps have already been taken, and what else is needed to revive the economy? One of the first steps taken by the UK government has been to raise interest rates to combat inflation. The Bank of England began gradually increasing rates in 2022, reaching 5% by the end of 2023. This helped slow inflation, but it also raised borrowing costs for businesses and households, which in turn became a drag on economic growth. Compared to the measures taken in the US and the Eurozone, the UK started raising rates later, making the fight against inflation a longer process. However, further action in this area remains critical to stabilizing prices and controlling inflation. Another key measure has been government subsidies for energy resources. To mitigate the impact of the energy crisis, temporary subsidies were introduced for households and businesses, which helped lower electricity bills. However, experts argue that this is only a short-term fix, and the country needs large-scale investments in renewable energy sources. The UK has significant potential in wind and solar energy, and increasing the share of renewable energy will help reduce dependence on global oil and gas prices. Another possible solution lies in strengthening government support for small and medium-sized businesses. In the current conditions, many businesses face financial difficulties due to tax pressure and high costs. Programs to reduce taxes for small businesses, provide low-interest loans, and support innovation could be key drivers of economic recovery. Germany, for example, actively uses incentives to stimulate entrepreneurship and investments in small businesses, which has had a positive effect on its economy. Revising immigration policy could also play an important role. The UK is in dire need of an influx of labor, especially skilled workers, to fill shortages in key sectors such as healthcare and technology. Developing a more flexible visa system that attracts highly skilled migrants could give a boost to economic recovery and strengthen the country's competitiveness. The future outlook for the UK remains mixed. If the country can effectively implement measures to combat inflation, establish energy independence, and support businesses, the economy may begin to recover in the medium term. However, without structural reforms and long-term investments in key sectors, the UK risks further slowing growth, declining productivity, and deepening social inequality. Time will tell what steps the UK will take to overcome the current crisis. But one thing is clear. Without active government support and strategic investments, the recovery will be slow and painful. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the UK's biggest economic problem, and how can it be resolved? Subscribe to Simple Economics, hit the like button, and stay tuned for more videos.